Okay, I think we're going to go.
Okay.
Salam, namaste, hello. Welcome to the Summer of ISHQ, our fifth session today, and our hot extension of a flagship speaker series hosted by the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. My name is Madhavi Menon. I'm Professor of English and Director of the Center. And our series Summer of ISHQ is named for Ishq, which as a word in Hindustani translates into love, desire, passion, and as an acronym, Issues in Society, History, Queerness, allows us to theorize and politicize that passion. We've had 4 sessions so far on rights, on law, on politics, and on cinema. Today's session is going to be on borders, and we have one final session on education next week, about which I'll speak at the end. Before introducing you to our speakers and our question for today, just a quick word about the format. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes at the beginning, and then they will have a cross conversation between themselves for another 10 minutes. And the last 30 minutes is going to be devoted to Q&As with the audience. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button saying Q&A very helpfully. Please post your questions there online during the first 30 minutes of the session, because we won't be able to take questions after that. Please make sure your questions are brief and pithy and brilliant, because we want to accommodate as many questions as we possibly can. So let me begin today's session then by introducing our wonderful speakers. Jack Halberstam will go first. Jack is Professor of Gender and English at Columbia University, Gender Studies and English at Columbia University, and Naisargi is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. The question that we have posed to them, broad, general, with which they can do what they want, is what is a human body? And Jack will go first. Jack, all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Madhavi. And I'm delighted to be here in conversation with you and with Naisargi. So 10 minutes goes quickly. I'm just going to make a couple of proposals that I hope will spark a bit of conversation. I think the question about the human body that Naisargi and I can converse about has to do with this particular boundary between the animal and the human. I mean, that's one boundary that a lot of people are interested in, and that both of us have interesting and I think divergent work on that question. The work that I want to present today, though, comes from a book I just finished that's coming out in October called Wild Things. And I'm just going to share my screen here to get through my proposal. So here you see a graffiti of an image from the very famous Maurice Sendak book, Where the Wild Things Are, that sort of lends its title to my book, which is interested in the sort of the colonial history of the cleavage between the question of civilization and then everything that lies outside of civilization, which is given this category the name wildness. And wildness can mean everything from sort of anarchic behavior to animality to unchecked nature to a kind of political anarchism. But I'm using it in a kind of decolonial or anti-colonial way to say, in this moment in history, where we're very much done with the civilizational paradigm, surely the category of wildness holds some kind of promise within it for thinking against the logics that have been imposed upon us by a colonial order of things. Okay, so that's the basic thesis of the book, is because these binaries have been the structures through which people have come to know themselves as humans and as human bodies, because of these structures of classification, you know, as they begin to fall apart, one wants to pay careful attention to the subjugated term within the binary. And wildness is a really, really great category right now, because there's an opportunity within the category of wildness to think about the environment, to think about the decolonial, to think about something that we have called queer, but that sort of goes beyond queerness. And of course, to think about this very permeable boundary between the human and the animal. The other thing about wildness is that it's also used to shore up racial hierarchies, and everything from the category of wilding as it has been used to accuse particularly Black subjects of sexually inappropriate behavior, to Hegelian notions of the difference between thought and rationality and savagery and wildness. We can see that race is a crucial part of thinking about wildness too. Okay. So let me just make, on the basis of that, if you grant me that wildness maybe is a category that we might want to think with at this particular moment, 5 proposals then drawn from my book. One, there is always a disorder of things, right? So we're so used to thinking with Foucault about the history of classification, about the production of an order of things that is both scientific, that is relayed to us through expertise, that is part and parcel of a sort of social system of stability and governance. But to the extent that we believe there's an order of things, there must be a disorder of things. And that disorder should be of interest to us politically. And I think that's what we're seeing right now in this moment of crisis, is that people want to bring disorder to the systems that govern us, whether those are policing, whether those are to do with prisons, whether those are to do with the university. The governance of people through these ordering institutions demands a political response based upon disorder. And there are any number of ways in which that disorder can be brought about, but partly it's in the collapse of these distinctions that we've held on to between human and animal, human and thingliness, right? Wild things, where the wild things are. And then, and I'll get to this in my 5th point, living and dead. That's another one of these boundaries within the category of the human that has become permeable and potentially is collapsing right now. Mm-hmm. Now, if we just want to think about this idea that there is always a disorder of things, for anyone who has read Maurice Sendak's beautiful children's book, Where the Wild Things Are, you'll remember that it is kind of a colonial narrative, right? It's a little boy who is playing around in his family home. He puts on a wolf suit. He fights with his mother, and she banishes him to his room. And from there, he's like, oh, don't just banish me to my room. I want out of this family home altogether. And he goes off and sails across, oceans and arrives where the wild things are. And the question of the book, and the question that my book then picks up and tries to answer, is when we take that journey to where the wild things are because we ourselves are interested in the wild, is it possible to abandon the colonial narrative within which we then set about trying to rule the so-called wild things, right? That's the narrative. He arrives where the wild things are, and he becomes the wildest one of all and the king, and eventually gets tired of this and leaves. So the question is, can we have a decolonial approach to wildness that doesn't seek to master it, doesn't seek to know it, doesn't seek to differentiate from it, but seeks in some way to inhabit it and take up the logics that are available there? Okay, in my work, proposition number 2, I've looked, if I think about how to apply this to my own work, I've used categories like trans asterisk, not to offer us another clear distinction, trans cis, but in fact to try to put pressure on the gender binary in the first place. So in early work on female masculinity, and then more recently in trans asterisk, I just suggest that there are wild and somewhat indeterminate categories of gender that do not simply get slotted into the opposite of cis, but exceed the boundaries and the categories that have been named in order to contain them. So proposition number 2, isn't this one thing that we should be doing, like seeking these autonomous spaces within which we proliferate orders of classification rather than trying to shoehorn ourselves into them, or on the other hand, imagining that those categories simply no longer exist and we want to enter into the universal or the neutral. So we want to think about the possibility then of occupying the space of the undefinable, wild thing. Thingness is the refusal of classification, if you like. To be a wild thing is not to be something is not to be the other to a subject, but is to try to occupy the space of the undefinable, which James C. Scott has suggested is a space that we haven't properly interrogated for autonomous political activity. Okay, proposition number 3 then. Anyone who's looking at wildness has to engage the notion of queer Indigenous critique at some point. It would be ridiculous to think about wildness separate from indigeneity, given that discourses like Manifest Destiny have already scripted a landscape as wild and the people within it as savages on behalf of a conquest disposition that seeks to reorder that landscape. So if we're interested in what wildness has to offer, then we have to look into queer Indigenous critique in order to find some of that promise. So what I argue is that in the work of people like Jodie Bird, and in the artwork of somebody like Kent Monkman, who is a Canadian Cree Two-Spirit artist who takes up 19th century painting and repaints all these scenes of the West from this perspective of the native or the Indian. And this particular picture, you can see how erotic it is, the relationship between the artist and the model, but also how the power dynamics change when one person is at the easel instead of being constantly depicted. What I argue is that Kent Monkman's work puts an aesthetic of bewilderment in place of an ethics of certainty. And a lot of his paintings have a kind of horizontality that transform the hierarchies of the colonial order of things. In one piece, and I'll just, I'm just going to allude quickly because I don't have time to get into his work, but in one piece, he reperforms a 19th century painting by George Catlin called Dance to the Berdache, in which George Catlin said, oh, these native people are so horrendous. They have this third gender, and it's really one of the most despicable things I've ever seen. And then makes this painting of the Dance of the Berdache. Kent Monkman, in his alter ego of Mischief Eagle Testicle, reperforms the Dance of the Berdache to the score of Rite of Spring, and brings out the tribal rhythms that Stravinsky had already appropriated in Rite of Spring, and puts them into play as part of this aesthetic of bewilderment, turning the tables on the colonial, the modernist, the European on the one hand, and on the other hand, investing in this notion of a bewildering confusion.
Jack, about 30 seconds to go.
Okay, so just the other two are just really quickly. The human-animal divide is at its most permeable in domestic spaces where humans and animals live side by side. And my argument is not that, when we make our home with the animal, we are helping the animal, but that in fact, pet owning is a colonial order of things. And that what we do is we turn the pet into our zombie. We turn the pet into a kind of incarcerated friend. And then we tell ourselves this narrative that we are saving it and that we are being kind to it. But I think that the pet encapsulates everything that is wrong with the relationship between animals and humans. And so you have a cartoon like The Secret Life of Pets, where the pets are secretly trying to free themselves. Finally, then, maybe we have to think about this final boundary, the boundary between living and the dead, which has been exploited in contemporary culture through the figure of the zombie. And I'm going to argue, I argue in this book for a kind of inhabiting of the function of the zombie in order to refuse the distinction between the humans and the walking dead. And the walking dead in the end are all kinds of people who are on the outside of the category of the human, the sick, the old, the animal, the child, the incarcerated, the mentally unstable and unwell, and so on. So zombies are us.
Thank you so much, Jack, for that juicy presentation. We'll hear Naisargi and then another conversation. Naisargi, all yours.
Great, thank you. And thanks, just to echo Jack's thanks to Madhvi and Shiv and everybody for inviting me. And it's great to be in conversation with you, Jack. So I'll begin with what's probably a very predictable move, and that's to respond to the question, what is a human body, by saying that there is no such thing as a human body. And I'll say that for two main reasons. One, the human body, as we imagine it in the sort of anthrocorporeal imaginary, which is to say, is coming with this shape, and by virtue of this shape is endowed with certain kinds of rights and recognitions. That human body is both overly imperiously inclusive, and because that human body is overly and imperiously exclusive. Or to put it differently, I want to suggest that the human body does not exist because what we normatively conceive of as the human body is both too much and not enough. So I'll start with the fun side of that equation. So this human body contains within its traditional normative boundary what Elizabeth Povinelli wonderfully calls the epidermal imaginary. Trillions of distinct organisms that feed off of what we feed them, produce waste, and becomes meals for the others, and on and on and on. There's so many of these beings that altogether they weigh as much as our brains. And these are activities or other than human existences that some scientists say are responsible for nothing short than our individuality itself, our sense, our tastes, our moods, our cravings, our dreams. Starting to refer to these trillions of distinct beings in shorthand as our microbiome, a world within the world that is the contained human body. Or some scientists have taken to thinking of the microbiome collectively as a vital human organ. And so what strikes me is that this discovery of the trillions of other than human bodies that make up the thing that we call a human body has only reified rather than unsettled the epidermal imaginary, a world within a world, a human organ, a mass. But in fact, perhaps it's more productive to think of, to reimagine things so that what we think of as the human body is utterly entangled with and co-constituted by non-humans. Or we might say the human body is constitutively non-human, and the non-humans who constitute us are constitutively human-bodied. And furthermore, what if, and this is a question that Povinelli also asks in Geontologies, instead of the, quote, epidermal point of view of each human body as separate and sovereign, we contemplated the question of what a human body is from the perspective of the lungs, so a pulmonary point of view. From the perspective of the lungs, so in, out, in, out, in, out, where to be separate means death, the human body is, as Shunryu Suzuki puts it in a very, very different context, but a swinging door. Asking the question of perspective is important here because it raises the problem of context, or of where we make the cut in order to both ask and then presume to answer certain questions. For instance, Madhvi's question, what is a human body, could just as well be a question about the nature of the social. It could be what is a human body, or it could be what is a human body. So in arguing that the human body does not exist, then, one runs into a very real political, social, and philosophical problem, one that was touched on in the first seminar a few weeks ago with Judith Butler and Ratna. So to be recognized as a human body with the rights and protections that such recognition affords is, as we all know, an unequally distributed privilege. The human body, by virtue of its exclusivity, thus becomes an aspirational horizon, an achievement, but one which is always precarious. Those who have one must seek to maintain it, and those who haven't one must figure out how to achieve it more accurately, just hope to be in the right place at the right time when liberal benevolence inevitably expands and contracts. We have tended to deal with this problem of an exclusive humanity as one of dehumanization, which in response requires a repudiation of both animality and of thingness. I am a woman, not an it. Thank you very much. I am a man, not an animal. This is a sensible politics, but is it a liberatory ontology? In other words, is it true that I'm a woman and not an it, or a human and not a multitude? And if not, what is surrendered in the aspiration for a never enough, always excessive humanity? Zakiya Imam, in her recent and absolutely amazing book that I highly recommend called Becoming Human, takes a very different approach, one that doesn't desire the human and therefore doesn't repudiate the animal. She argues that the assumption made in animal studies and posthumanism, largely white-dominated, is that the human-animal cleavage is the foundational one upon which all other human differences are grounded. But the fact is, and the literary record shows, that the representation of the, quote, animal co-evolved with the representation of blackness, which itself was always defined through an aberrant and excessive female sexuality. The consequences of her rethinking are vital. It is not that blackened persons, including the feminine, are bestialized as if bestialization came first. It's that the very concept of the animal is thoroughly and foundationally blackened, feminized, aberrantly sexualized, raced. This is oversimplifying, but it's as if to repudiate the animal is to repudiate ourselves. And to desire the human is to desire that which has already misappropriated us. And so she argues that, quote, what is commonly deemed dehumanization is more accurately interpreted as the violence of humanization, or the burden of inclusion into a racially hierarchized universal humanity, unquote. This reminds me of something that Fred Moten writes in Black and Blur, in an essay on poetry and dance. Humanity is antisocial, he says. The human is never more or less than one. So don't let him humanize us. We and them are more and less than that. There are shades here of Donna Haraway's feminist posthumanist cyborg manifesto. One is too few and too many, she says. There's a common theme across all of these writings of both the loneliness and the enforced belonging of the human body as normatively constituted. So what then are the alternatives to seeking inclusion into this antisocial humanity? Pavanelli suggests that we ask the question from the perspective of the lungs, but I think we can remain with the skin as Moten does, but in a way that unsettles the epidermal point of view. What if the alternative to antisocial humanity is to think of the body less as a thing and more as an always imminent enactment between? I'm thinking of Aniket Javade's On Touching and Not Touching, in which to refuse the touch of another is a denial of humanity, while to expose and be exposed to touch is a materialization of it. So I'll conclude on this note, that there is much about individuality, autonomy, and certainly interiority that I'm attached to. And for that matter, the political subjectivities that allow us to demand the annihilation of caste, the abolition of prisons, the liberation of animals, the radical queering of the social beyond the family and the couple form, and the distribution of a living wage. Refusing the human as an object of conceptual desire is not, for me anyway, about throwing open the skin or repudiating the self. It's just to say, borrowing from Moten again, that the self is both more and less than human. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Naisargi. Just had a sort of quick question for you. We only have about 5 minutes before we throw it open to questions from the audience. I mean, you both spoke so powerfully about wildness, about the inhumanity, about what gets included, what gets excluded. You both spoke very powerfully about race as well. I'm just wondering if you could, is the body always normative, or is there something queer about the body that we can talk about as well?
I mean, the body is always normative and queer. Again, it's not this cleavage that is neatly and with certainty divided up and filtered into the right bodies. I think that's the point. In the work that I'm doing, sometimes queerness is synonymous with wildness, and sometimes queerness is what happens when we leave sexuality wholly in the realm of a kind of organizational human impulse. And I have found all kinds of texts where supposedly queer writers are not expressing simply desire for same-sex partners, but express very deep desires for the wild itself. And I have a whole series of falconry narratives that I've been looking at, in which writers who've been classified as gay have no interest in talking about their same-sex desires, but lots of interest in thinking about themselves through the bird as a wild thing. So I think wildness, again, asks us to get out of that binary of, is this normal or is this queer?
Great.
Yeah.
Naisargi?
I agree with that. And I would maybe even go further, was to say the body is queer first. I mean, just look at it. It's queer. It's a queer thing. And we do queer things with it. And the normalization of it is the aberration, and the desire for that normalization of a certain kind of that anthrocorporeal form that comes with certain kinds of social responsibilities of coupledom and heteronormativity. That's I mean, what comes before that is absolutely an inherently queer thing, which is the body of all sorts.
I mean, that's great, because I was just sort of reminded, listening to the two of you, what about the concept of wild sex, for instance, right? I mean, who has wild sex? What does that even mean? Does anyone have normal sex? Is there anything normal about sex, or is it always wild?
I think we're just so over the, having sex equals somehow entering into some kind of subversive contract. I mean, straight men are probably, they're the world's consumers of sex work, and are arrogating to themselves all kinds of sexual activities. Sex is not guaranteed at all to be something subversive or wild. And I think what we're talking about in terms of queerness or wildness is a set of desires that are sex, but are also something more than sex, and have another kind of orientation as well, especially in an era of Grindr and Tinder and these kinds of web apps that, make sex into a commodity, a global commodity at that.
Naisargi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jack that the thought of, the idea that sex holds some kind of inherently sort of liberatory or wild potential, and I know it's not what you were suggesting, but that, that's normally not what we find. And yes, I do think there are people who have very normal, not wild sex. But the question that interests me is, I wonder what's going to happen to sex after this sort of period of a lack of touch, right? I mean, how does all touch become kind of inherently, wild, indeterminate, uncertain, anxious? So thinking about touch and sex in this particular moment, I think is interesting.
The other thing that I think we might talk about, and we can do it when we get to the questions or now, is, you mentioned Haraway, Naisargi, and I'm just not sure any longer about some of the work by Haraway and Haraway students on the animal, especially in the light of something like Zakiya Jackson's book, because I still think that there's a very humanist orientation to the sort of when species meet paradigm, and the companion species too, where it's like, look, me and my dog, we're training each other. And it's like, well, are you training each other, or are you just training your dog to be a good companion, So I wonder what animal studies looks like once we take up Jackson's challenge to, instead of thinking about dehumanization, exactly as you put it, think about the violence of inclusion, particularly for me, when we bring the animal into the family home, domesticate it, and then claim that this is a site of love.
Jack, I love your anti-domestic pet policy. Love it. And hopefully there'll be some questions about that too. I'm going to hand things over to Shiv now, who has curated some of the many, many questions that have already come in for you. And all yours, Shiv.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Dave and Professor Halberstam, for that rich, wild discussion on the subject. So the first question actually leads directly from what we were just talking about. But instead of sex, it talks about love. So what do you think is the role of love and passion, especially for Professor Dave in your ethnographies of activism? On the one hand, animal activists are posited as animal lovers, And on the other, queer activism is often based on a rhetoric of love. So what are the dangers of thinking in terms of love, and how does it play out in the two cases?
I'll take a stab at that first. So, and allow me to reinforce how I really appreciated Jack's comment just now, that I couldn't agree more. And I think that part of what happened with the multi-species turn and all the rhetoric around entanglement is it lost sight of the role that property, like a certain kind of bourgeois notion of the animal as property, nameable and therefore lovable, became an alibi for a more capacious ethical engagement with the animal mother, right? To love an animal is somehow enough, right? And love allows us to, it provides a kind of, as I said earlier, an alibi to thinking about relationships of property that are really inherent to what we romanticize as love. So again, it's one of these things that's politically sensible, but is it a liberatory ontology, right? Is it true, right? It is politically sensible, certainly in queer activism, but it's very interesting that it plays a kind of contrary role to a political engagement with animals, right? That the whole rhetoric of, first of all, animal lover is a kind of insane being who, has wild hair and feeds animals on the street and things like that. And so as a way to dismiss a kind of mad love, right? But then on the other hand, to say that because I love particular animals, I am somehow released from a larger ethical obligation. And that's exactly how family works too, right? As a kind of island of moral responsibility that absolves us of a kind of larger, a more capacious, imminent ethical engagement.
Yeah, and when you're talking about mad love, Naisargi, I was also then reminded that one of the major splits that pet owning depends upon is between sex and love, because you can love that animal, and a la Donna Haraway in the Companion Species Manifesto, you can exchange DNA in a sloppy kiss with said animal, but you may not have sex. I was going to use another term, but who knows, maybe I'm not allowed. You may not have sex with that animal, right? So bestiality becomes a division. And that goes back to Madhavi's question a minute ago about wild sex. You want wild sex? Bad. You can't have wild sex. In fact, you can only have the proper relationship to the animal, which is one of love. And love, as we know, and there's been lots written in post-colonial thinking about love, love has been such a vector, white love has been such a vector for colonial rule, that I think despite the fact that some Marxist thinkers like Hart and Agree and some decolonial thinkers like Jackie Alexander have quite an investment in love as a potentially redemptive set of connections, in actual fact, love is a kind of governance script, and you just nailed it with that comment about the family, Naisargi. It's like this moral responsibility that if you are loved, then there are all of these things that you have to do in return. So I think that that division between bestiality and love should tell us that everything that is wrong about that, that the pet animal lover distinction.
Just to sort of bolster what both of you have said so fabulously, the recent judgment in India in 2018 decriminalizing homosexuality or same-sex desire, it sort of didn't do away with the section entirely, just sort of read it down, did away with a bit of it. But the bit that remains is the section against bestiality, because it's like that is a frontier no one wants to cross, right? So you can even have same-sex sex, but not with animals. So I think that
sodomy means sex with animals as well as sex with an inappropriate partner, right?
Exactly.
And those two things were folded into each other. So apparently at one point, lots of people were having lots of sex with animals. If they would, why would you need a statute against it? Yeah. And it's true in the US too. Those things have been divided. You take down the sodomy statute, but you leave the bestiality in place. And Gabriel Rosenberg has written fabulous analyses of this distinction, and says, a lot about how this actually pertains to the production of meat, because there's all kinds of animal husbandry that involves stuff that looks like sex. you know, artificial insemination of an animal. And he shows how, in fact, bestiality laws are connected to the meat industry.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to take sort of a wild run with Professor Halberstam's just allusion to exchanging the DNA. And this is a question, I think, which is relevant to now. How are you all thinking about virality in the wake of the pandemic today? And what possibilities, foreclosures does the virus engender?
How are we thinking about virality and what possibilities, what?
Foreclosures does the virus engender?
Foreclosure. I mean, everyone has to think about virality today. You know, it's one of our key terms, right? Not just in terms of health and the actual viruses that are leaping, remember, from animal to human, not because some bad wet market in China, but because of these structures within which humans have encroached upon animal territory in such a way that there is no longer the boundaries that in the past allowed for a kind of prophylactic barrier between such transmissions, right? So virality is the product of global capitalism, and it is also the vector of global capitalism. If you think about online virality, you know, a lot of online activity, it wants to find one of these viral waves in order to create endless publicity. So virality is metaphoric, it is physical, it is medical, and it's something that we cannot not think about. And it is also wild. I mean, notice that it is not subject to human control. And it is a message of some kind that we are very, very poor at decoding. And this is where Povinelli's work comes in again, right, Naisargi, that there's a whole element in geontologies about the virus as one of the figures that Povinelli has picked out for contemporary life to think with.
Right, to think the division between life and non-life that you gestured to in your presentation earlier, is right. So we both of us sort of initially approached the question, what is a human body, to think about its relationship to animality. But the real question there is perhaps the life, non-life divide, right, that Povinelli talks about there. And in terms of, you know, virality, yes, as Jack said, we can't, you know, all of us have to be thinking about it these days. But one of the foreclosures is certainly, again, the social form of the family and the couple that's, you know, been enlarged by the idea of the pod. But the way, you know, so with virality, we think of what does travel and what does infiltrate. What kinds of relationalities, particularly queer ones, it seems, are prevented from, has its mobility stanched by the crisis responses to the virus, as sort of doubling down on borders.
Yeah.
Thank you both. So the next question is, based on what you both have described, how does it help us rethink the politics and the political? And I'll also just allude to, Professor Dave, what you've said somewhere else in a different context, that not everything is political. So what kind of relationship do you imagine to the politics based on your work and what you've just said?
So when saying that not everything is political, I should clarify that. In that, what I mean is that politics requires the definition of a demarcation of a field. Right? That's at the heart of the political. And I'm saying that not everything, that most things actually escape the demarcation of the field. The field gives us the impression of an encompassment of ideas, values, and sides on which to be, right? But using Jack's terms, I think most of what exists in the world is wild and indeterminate. And then we have the illusion of it being demarcated into clear fields in which we have clear choices to make. So that's what I mean when I say that not everything is political, and that I think most things, affects, sensations, resonances, far exceed those demarcations. So how do we think about social life and ethical life with the recognition that most things are actually wild? in that we do not have the answers in advance. So it's sort of, to use Jack's terms again, about in ethics of what I call immanence in other places, but I think it's another way of thinking about bewilderment, which is to say, I do not know in advance which team I'm on and how that, which island I belong to, and therefore how I respond to something that is in front of me. So that to me is sort of the crux of how we think about a social world that's not as clearly demarcated as we would like to think.
Yeah, and I think we're both sort of saying that the political has been too narrowly defined. I mean, particularly if you look at the US, the political is what? Electoral politics. I mean, that's not political really. That's actually still economic, still about wealthy people making sure that they or their people get elected so that they or their people can represent the interests of the ruling class. I mean, this is, it's not exactly politics where things need to be sorted out. It's just a political system that is designed to keep everything in place. And when that's the case, you don't want the political, you want something else. And I think that that's what we're looking for a vocabulary for, is a way of being in the world that isn't, routed through these terrible, really, electoral systems that are rigged in advance and deliver to us people like Donald Trump, and then have everyone putting their hands in the air and saying, how could that happen? Because that's what the political system is for. It wasn't designed to deliver to you a radical who will change everything. It's designed to give you, the path of least resistance.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask this next question also because I think personally for me, it's a deeply political question that I am invested in. And this is addressed to Professor Halberstam, but either of you could respond. That would you extend your critical position vis-a-vis domestic pets to the desire for raising children or desire for children? Is raising children inevitably a colonizing or normativizing project too?
Oh God, yeah, it is. But that, again, it's because of the enclosure called the family that we've decided is the right unit for raising children, which means that two, neurotic people or tired people or people who have long ceased to be intimate, have the responsibility of these two immature humans in their hands. It's a terrible method. And children are wild. If children weren't wild, you would not need these training hands and these training manuals. You wouldn't need to be constantly on the watch, right? So I think the family pet and the family child, they're not the same, but they are structurally embedded in a system that accords them similar kinds of positions. And I do think Haraway is absolutely right that it's a mistake to fold one into the other. It isn't. But demographically speaking, the decline in reproduction in white households has been met by an increase in pet owning and pet industries. And there's lots of work that's being done on the demographics of pet owning among white bourgeois communities who then advocate, for example, to take over vast swathes of the city for their damn animals to go and poop, right? So dog runs instead of parks. And I live in Brooklyn and I'm saying I'm going to run for mayor just so I can get dogs banned in Brooklyn, which apparently no one thinks is a winning platform. I'm not sure why. But, dogs in the city, it's just like a complete and utter narcissistic investment. You take that animal outside, tell it to poop, and you go back inside with it. So there's something with the child, there's a little bit more rebellion there, to be honest with you. They don't poop on command, for example. So I think there's a connection, but I also think that the actual relationship to the category of the human, of the child and the animal, they are structurally different.
Now's the time for one of our pet dogs to walk past the screen, isn't it?
That's like some Zoom thing where everyone has to have their animal walk by and then,
exactly.
An admiring comment.
But Naisargi, please.
Right, or their child, their adorable child.
Indeed.
Yes, well, I don't have that much to add to what Jack said, other than to, you know, very much agree. And the question of, you know, sexuality that Halberstam raised, that Jack raised earlier, come here too, right? In terms of thinking about how love is understood in a particular way that is exclusive of the erotic, that applies both to, and this is another one of these structural similarities, both the child and the pet. And so home as a space of kind of, I guess, of sexual innocence of the child and the animal is another interesting thing to think through.
Thank you. I think this next question, and this has come up again and again in the questions from the audience, and relates to both the child and animals. And it's about basically agency, the questions of agency and consent. And the people are asking, is agency and consent still a human normative concept that would need to be rethought in order for us to grasp what you both are talking about?
I'll let Naisargi have that one.
Okay, all right, okay. So let's go to, so much of animal politics, as well as politics that speaks on behalf of the child, right, is premised on an idea of they cannot speak for themselves, right? And what's really problematic about that is that, of course, animals speak, right? I mean, as Spivak said so many years ago, the problem is not with something to speak, it's with them not being able to be heard, right? So when the pet is straining to get off of our lap and we're there because we're anxious, we keep it there, but we know it wants to get up, right? Hence the kind of the model of incarceration. And the whole logic of consent is in some ways premised on this untenable division between those who we perceive as being able to speak and those who we perceive as being incapable of speech. So if it's premised on this kind of, at the beginning, an untenable distinction that then is used to prop up, say, ideas about innocence, as we were talking about earlier, that consent itself is not something that we want to, as liberal benevolence does, like just expand to more and more kinds of subjects. But I think something that needs to be rethought of, again, along these lines of how we understand speech and expression as rooted in particular kind of human subjectivities, adult human, able-bodied subjectivities.
Yeah, it's true that consent is one of these thorny issues that is applied a lot to the relationship between the human and animal, but mostly in relationship to the question of bestiality, where the argument will be that the animal cannot consent and therefore this can only be an act of rape. But the point is, we don't know if the animal consents to most of the things that it is subject to in a domestic space. Does the animal consent, for example, to eating the shitty dog food that you give it? Did it say, yeah, this is really tasty, or is it just like there's nothing else, right? Does the animal consent to sleeping in your bed, or is that where you make the animal sleep? Does the animal consent to being kissed, caressed, cuddled, any of these things? How would you know? Oh, it's tails wagging. Well, the tail wag could be like, I'm having a hard time here, help me, So we're constantly interpreting animal behavior and then making assumptions about the dog or the cat or the animal's agency and so on. So I think, the thing is, when you start talking about pets, you realize that no activity, no agency, no act that the animal engages in that pet dynamic can be interpreted separate from the human. And that's the colonial relation, okay? So there's a great book called How Forests Think by Eduardo Cohen, which is about systems of signification within the forest, and his ethnography is in Ecuador. And he takes the human out of the equation and thinks about how vegetal worlds and animal worlds interact and structure communication in a post-linguistic or extra-linguistic sense. And I think that's kind of helpful to get the human out of the way with our baggage, like love, like agency, like consent. Get that stuff out of the way and then see what might constitute what Naisargi is calling speech for the animal.
Thank you so much. In the next question, and I think Professor Halberstam, you alluded to this in your sort of 6 points about what you refer to as wildness, and that was trans with an asterisk. So what do you think of the relationship between transness and queerness, and trans politics and queer politics? And either of you could.
Okay, it's a big question. I'll just say something very briefly, which is that trans is a very specific manifestation of queerness. It isn't just the same. You can have transgender people who are at a distance from queer politics and have no desire to be queer, but actually simply want to be allowed to be normal. And many people have made that argument. But there are plenty of trans people for whom their experience of marginalization of necessity forces them into a kind of queer relation to normative society. So I look, however, for a deliberately radical politics under the heading of trans, and that may or may not have to do with the relationships with other people who meet under the umbrella of queer. The more interesting trans politics, really, which have been articulated by people like Dean Spade, are the trans politics that are in solidarity with other politics of abolition and other politics of solidarity. And I think that's the more interesting connection.
Professor Dave, do you want to add
I'll treat Jack as the authority on.
Right. So the next question then is talking about wildness. Is a prehistory / genealogical account of wildness possible? What kind of methods beyond the existing disciplinary boundaries can be taken up? And I'll just broaden it to also ask, what does it mean to say the body has a history? What kind of history is it?
Do you want to say anything about the history, Naisargi?
What kind of, so your two last questions, Shiv, were if the body has a history, what kind of history is it? Is that right? I would probably suggest that there's no singular history to it, though it appears as just a broad stroke to answer that question. It tends to be a history of cleavages, a history of differentiation. And I think a kind of queer history of the body or a queer approach to the body is precisely to think of this kind of one is too few, two is too many. So not about either cleavages or couplings, neither likenesses nor differences. So that to me would be in a kind of an alternative history of the human body rather than one which is premised on couplings and cleavages.
Yeah.
Professor Halberstam, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's fine.
Okay. I mean, then the next question, and since we don't have much time left, probably this will be the last question, is people asking you to expand on your idea of ethics of certainty. And Professor Dave, you've in different contexts talked about the tyranny of consistency. So do you two want to speak about that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a topic that we've both circled around, the way in which knowledge production seems intuitively connected to things like certainty and consistency, when in fact it's disciplinary knowledge that demands certainty and demands mastery and demands that something be recognizable and definitive. So I think in many ways, it's not an ethics question. It's probably an epistemological question within which the quest to know is separated out from the quest to master and contain and confine. So the ethics of bewilderment, the aesthetics of bewilderment is such that you could be drawn into an artwork, not in order to know it, but in order to experience what being lost feels like, or what not knowing feels like. And here we can think about like a kind of pedagogy that comes out of unknowing rather than always being sure. And you can see that in the work of Monkman. He's constantly turning his gaze back onto a Western tradition of modernist art, and you know, taking bits and pieces of modernist art, putting it in his own work, and then redistributing Western myths, making unsense of them, like chopping them up, turning them into tableaus that feature genderqueer bodies, making it so that they're unreadable according to the logics with which they were written. That then offers us not the complete break from the past, but a way of rereading the past through these decolonial strategies that, you know, offer a kind of delightful confusion. And it's at that point that something new can begin.
Professor,
maybe one last question.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Should I?
Please go ahead.
Sure, yeah. So, you know, speaking of certainty, it's interesting because, you know, what I'm trying to get at in part with that, the piece on tyranny of consistency is that, strictly speaking, a certain ethics is not actually ethical, right? All it is repeating rote behaviors that you've decided in advance is your approach to things, right? So so to think about the question of uncertainty, I think it's central to any kind of ethical engagement with the world that's not, I guess, purely political in the sense that I was talking about earlier, right? Is knowing what its field is and what team you're on and what the correct decisions are from the start. So to think about ethics more as kind of resonance and response, and being forced to be in that sort of bewilderment of not knowing, such that each interaction becomes a space for something ethical, just wrote, right? And to think about certainty in terms of politics, it's actually, you know, so much of like animal politics, right? I mean, and I'm guilty, I've been a vegan for 25 years or whatever. I'm not proud of that fact, but I am one. And, you know, part of the problem with that is that kind of political subjectivity rarely achieves what it thinks it's achieving, because it's a kind of forcing a subjectivity on others, right? And that kind of certainty can tend to be, I don't know, get into a language of purity, and which is already at the ground of most, I don't know, politically oppressive relationships, is certainty, purity, and knowing in advance.
I mean, I think that's so terrific. And I think that very much is one of the differences, perhaps, between the West broadly defined and the East broadly defined, with India as an example, where vegetarianism now has all this sort of political valence, which is actually extremely oppressive, extremely communal, extremely problematic. So whereas in the West, it still is sort of seen as a good thing and a pure thing. But anyway, Shiv, are we out of time? Do we have time for one last question? What do you think?
We have 1 minute to go, and if both Professor Dave and Halberstam assure us to be brief, we can.
Great, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, so this question is about, you know, Dr. Halberstam's formulation of the wildness and Dr. Dave's hypotheses on unsettling the epidermal. Speak to the body under incarceration, the refugee's body, the migrant labor's body, the body under military attack. How do we sort of broaden this framework to include and talk about all of these bodies? This is basically the question.
Well, that's what these classification systems do. They seem to just be naming an order of things that already exists, you know, and, you know, formalizing it, when in fact these classification systems from the 18th and 19th century have imposed the order of things that then produces inevitably there's a class of the so-called criminals, the so-called, you know, stateless, and so on. So the whole point about turning away from civilization and not refusing to just see wildness as an empty category that was produced as the negative of something, what the move here rhetorically, and I hope politically, is to say that there's actually an interesting set of affiliations between the people who are gathered under the heading of wildness that should allow us to think about a different kind of politics if we were to take that on. The politics of everyone who is pushed to the margins of the category of the human. That's most of the world, it turns out, you know, and it's in that kind of potential, not in queer politics, not in having lots of sex. It's in the potentially abolitional politics of re-inhabiting spaces of wild affiliation. There's a little tiny bit of potential.
As far as I'm concerned, that's a great place to leave it.
Well, okay. Thank you so much, Naisargi and Jack. That was absolutely fantastic and so productive and so rich in many different ways. Jack, I've already got lots of messages from people saying they're going to vote for you for mayor. So I think you should take that seriously and go for it. Thank you all so much for listening in. We'll be back next Thursday, July 23rd, same time, 9 p.m. for our last session on education with Paramita Vora and Lee Edelman. And we look forward to seeing you all there. All that remains for me is to thank our two wonderful, brilliant speakers this evening for giving us such amazing things to think about. Thank you, and thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.